April 9, 1865. The air is heavy with the weight of history as two men prepare to meet in a quiet Virginia village. One is Robert E. Lee, the proud and dignified general of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. He rides toward Appomattox Court House, his uniform immaculate, his ceremonial sword gleaming at his side, a symbol of honor, even in defeat. The other is Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Union forces, who arrives hours later in a mud-spattered coat that looks more suited for a common soldier than a general. Inside a modest brick house belonging to Wilmer McLean, these two men sit across from each other. They exchange words, sign documents, and shake hands. Outside, soldiers wait anxiously, some in silence, others in tears. It's over, or so it seems. For generations, this moment has been immortalized as the end of America's bloodiest conflict, the Civil War. But what if this wasn't truly the end? What if this meeting at Appomattox was only part of the story? Why did Lee surrender despite vowing never to do so? Was this meeting carefully staged for symbolism? Did one of Lee's closest generals push him toward surrender? And why did fighting continue for 16 months after this day? Today, we're uncovering what history often leaves out about that fateful moment in Appomattox, the untold truths behind Lee's surrender and its aftermath. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. General Robert E. Lee once famously declared that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. For years, he had been the face of Confederate resistance, a brilliant tactician who had led his troops through some of the war's most famous battles: Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chancellorsville. His resolve seemed unshakable. But by early April 1865, circumstances had changed dramatically. After nearly 10 months of brutal trench warfare around Petersburg and Richmond, Union forces under Grant finally broke through Confederate lines on April 2nd at Five Forks. This forced Lee to abandon both cities, the heart of the Confederacy, and retreat westward with his starving and exhausted army. The retreat was nothing short of a nightmare. On April 5th, Lee reached Amelia Courthouse expecting to find desperately needed supplies. But there were none. His men were starving, demoralized, and constantly harassed by Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan. On April 6th at Sailor's Creek, nearly a quarter of Lee's army was captured or killed in one devastating engagement. Witnessing this disaster reportedly led Lee to exclaim, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" By April 8th, it was clear there was no way out. Union forces had blocked Lee's path at Appomattox Station and captured vital supplies meant for his troops. Surrounded on all sides and with no reinforcements or escape routes left, Lee made the fateful decision to meet with Grant and discuss terms of surrender. Despite his earlier resolve never to surrender, Lee chose pragmatism over pride. He realized that continuing to fight would only result in unnecessary bloodshed and suffering, not just for his men, but for civilians across the South who had already endured 4 years of devastation. As Lee wrestled with the decision to surrender, one of his most trusted generals played a key role in shaping his choice: James Longstreet. Longstreet had been by Lee's side throughout much of the war, a pragmatic leader known for his ability to assess situations with cold logic rather than emotion. By early April 1865, Longstreet recognized that further resistance was futile. The Army of Northern Virginia was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and running out of supplies. On April 9th at Appomattox Station, General John B. Gordon reported that his corps had been fought to a frazzle during an attack on Union cavalry, blocking their path westward. With no hope of breaking through Union lines or receiving reinforcements, Longstreet reportedly advised Lee that surrendering was their only viable option left. However, not all officers agreed with Longstreet's pragmatism. Brigadier General Edward Porter Alexander suggested dissolving the army into smaller groups and waging guerrilla warfare against Union forces, a strategy he believed could prolong resistance indefinitely. But both Longstreet and Lee rejected this idea outright. Longstreet's influence during these final moments reflected his broader approach throughout the war. Practical decisions aimed at minimizing unnecessary suffering, even if it meant accepting defeat. One fascinating question historians have debated is whether Lee's surrender at Appomattox was staged, not in terms of being fake, but as a carefully orchestrated moment designed for symbolism and reconciliation. Consider this. Grant offered remarkably lenient terms to Lee and his men. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home after laying down their arms. Officers could keep their sidearms and personal horses, and no one would face prosecution so long as they abided by their paroles. Grant even provided rations for Lee's starving troops, 25,000 meals in total. These terms were not just practical, they were deeply symbolic. By allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with dignity and even keep their horses for farming, Grant set a tone of reconciliation rather than punishment. This approach wasn't just Grant's decision, it reflected President Abraham Lincoln's desire for a peaceful reunification of North and South. Even Wilmer McLean's house, the site of the surrender, added an element of symbolism. McLean had moved there after his previous home near Bull Run had been damaged during one of the war's first battles in 1861. Now, 4 years later, fate had brought him back into history as hostilities came to an end under his roof. Was this all coincidental, or was it carefully orchestrated? While we may never know for sure, it's clear that Appomattox became much more than just a military capitulation. It became a symbol of national healing. While Appomattox marked a turning point in American history, it did not signify the end of the Confederacy as many believe. General Robert E. Lee surrendered only his Army of Northern Virginia, not all Confederate forces across the South. At that very moment, other Confederate armies were still active across vast territories. General Joseph E. Johnston commanded tens of thousands of troops in North Carolina until he surrendered on April 26th, after negotiating terms with General Sherman, 17 days after Appomattox. Lieutenant General Richard Taylor continued resisting Union forces in Alabama and Mississippi until May 4th, when he finally surrendered after learning about Johnston's capitulation. West of the Mississippi River, Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith held out even longer, refusing to surrender until May 26th in Galveston, Texas. In Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, Brigadier General Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader commanding Native American troops, refused to lay down arms until June 23rd, making him the last Confederate general to surrender. Even Confederate President Jefferson Davis refused to concede defeat after fleeing Richmond on April 2nd. Captured on May 10th near Irwinville, Georgia, Davis believed guerrilla warfare could reignite Southern hopes for independence, a belief shared by some Confederate commanders who continued fighting well into mid-1865. Although April 9, 1865, is often remembered as the symbolic end of the Civil War, the reality was far more complicated. General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Court House marked the end of his Army of Northern Virginia, but it did not mean that the entire Confederacy had capitulated. In fact, fighting continued in various parts of the South for weeks and months after Appomattox. And it wasn't until August 20th, 1866, 16 months later, that President Andrew Johnson formally declared the Civil War over. The reasons for this prolonged timeline stemmed from slow communication, fragmented Confederate resistance, lingering battles, and political delays that reflected just how fractured the nation remained even after Lee laid down his arms. In 1865, communication across the United States was slow and unreliable compared to modern standards. News of Lee's surrender on April 9th took days and in some cases weeks to reach other Confederate commanders scattered across vast territories. Without confirmation that Lee had surrendered or that Richmond had fallen, many Confederate generals continued fighting under the assumption that their cause was still alive. The surrender at Appomattox is often remembered as the moment when the guns fell silent and the nation began to heal. But as we've uncovered, this was only part of the story. Lee's surrender didn't end the Confederacy, nor did it bring immediate peace. It was a symbolic act, a gesture of dignity and reconciliation. But the war's echoes would linger for months, even years, as the fractured nation struggled to rebuild itself. What if Lee had chosen guerrilla warfare instead of surrender? What if Jefferson Davis had managed to escape and rally Confederate forces? Could the war have dragged on even longer, or would it have ended in even greater devastation? These are questions that continue to haunt this chapter of history. So now we turn it over to you. Was Lee's decision to surrender an act of honor or inevitability? Was Grant's leniency a masterstroke of reconciliation or a missed opportunity for accountability? And what lessons can we draw from a moment that was both an ending and a beginning? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on one of America's most pivotal moments.